So, show of hands, who wants to be murdered? No one wants to be murdered. Lately on my channel, I've noticed a number of people commenting about safety in Mexico and worried about, is it safe here in Mexico for people from the United States to move here? So that's what we're going to be talking about in this video. So let's look at a couple of those comments. Dave from Canada mentioned that he just wanted to make sure that I was familiar with that El Chapo's son had been arrested and there was some violence going on in the area around Mazatlan. Say What 951, it says that he or she has been down here or was in Mexico for 34 years, but they're calling it a third world country and talking about all the violence that they experience. And people were asking, why aren't any YouTubers talking about this? But I'm going to tell you the answer to that by the end of this video. Let's get another one here. Someone suggested watching Borderland Beat. So if you want to get scared about moving to Mexico, go ahead, check out that YouTube channel. Yes, there is violence in Mexico, and I don't want to cover it up. I don't think any YouTubers are trying to cover up this fact. So in this video, we're going to talk about that violence, kind of the elephant in the room of moving to Mexico, and that is worry about personal safety. One other thing you might be worried about in Mexico is getting sick, and yes, you can tell from my voice that I am sick. It is not COVID. I have tested and I am doing okay, but that's where that little frog in my throat is from. But let's get back to the murder rate. The international news has been covering El Chapo's son was arrested this week, which led to a lot of violence in one of the states in Mexico, in the area around where he was captured. And yeah, there was a lot of violence there. There were a lot of cars set on fire. There was a lot of shooting, and there was an airplane that was hit. A passenger airplane was hit by a bullet, but no one was hurt inside. In fact, here, about 30 people were killed in this arrest situation. About 20 of them were members of the cartel, and about 10 of them were military members who were arresting him. There was one civilian who was injured, but not, I think it was a young boy or something. But the government did a really good job this time of making sure that they've messed this up in the past, specifically trying to capture the same guy. Of making sure that civilians were not hurt in this operation. But it was disruptive. The ferries from La Paz over to, Mazatlan and that area were canceled. The airports were shut down. It was very disruptive, but, and I think it's still going on. So I don't want to minimize the fact that it can be a dangerous place. And I'm going to go through numbers and things like that throughout this video. Really what I'm talking about this video is how this impacts expats or immigrants from the US or Canada or other countries. What does it look like for those of us who are down here, and why are we not necessarily afraid of all the violence? Because Mexico has a very high murder rate. There's also people who are just disappearing, who aren't necessarily caught, added to the murder rate. So, let's dig into some of those numbers. Also, I want to say this is not going to be about drug policy in the US, which I think is messed up. This is not going to be about the Mexican president's hugs, not bullets campaign in his attempt to stop the killings. It's not going to be about the policy that the US and Mexico seem to share of taking out the heads of the cartels because of what that does to the violence. And it's not going to be about how Mexico's cartels are using guns that are flowing from the United States across the border. This is going to be about what expats typically experience in Mexico. And this is also only my opinion with a little bit of Google research thrown in. So very quickly, the answer is the reason that YouTubers don't talk about violence in Mexico is that most people don't experience violence. Most expats don't experience violent crime, and that is why we don't talk about it. Two YouTubers did videos that I saw not too long ago about their phones being stolen by motorcyclists. Actually, one was an attempted steal, which ruined a gimbal, and the other was a successful steal of, I think, a brand new iPhone 13. So property crime definitely exists. Two of my subscribers were recently broken into here in La Paz. I'm actually going to throw up a map of where it was because they both were staying in the same neighborhood. But the first one had just moved in and they were essentially being watched. And when they went out to lunch, someone broke in and stole their laptops and their electronics, which is awful because it's hard to replace those things here in Mexico. It's much more expensive to replace them here in Mexico. There was definitely no violence involved in that crime. It's property crime. Similar, another couple in that same neighborhood. And I'm not saying that that neighborhood is unsafe, but maybe there's just, this is just bad luck, or maybe there's some criminal element that's there right now in 2022, 2023. But they were broken into, and also one of the robbers was there hiding in their shower when they went to the bathroom. And there was no violence. I think this was just a surprise from the robber. And the robber was as surprised as the expats were. So it is possible that bad things can happen, but it's much more likely that your things will be stolen in Mexico than you will be hurt. And I think that's just a reality of the economic situation here, is that just in Mexico in general, there are some very wealthy people and some very poor people. And then when you throw in the expats, we tend to be closer to the wealthy end of that spectrum. And so people are desperate, and they are, some of them, choosing crime as a way to even things out a bit. But in Mexico, although their constitution says that everyone can own a handgun and some rifles if you're part of a hunting club, very few people do. The guns are all in the hands of the cartels, just because of the way they're brought across the border. So for the most part, most kind of petty criminals do not have guns. So it is much less of a worry. And most of that violent crime is tied to the cartels. And the murder rate in Mexico really is focused on certain geographic areas and also certain age groups. So it's mostly young men who are dying, who are kind of skewing the statistics to make it look really bad. Now, if you're one of those young men and you're in an area that, cartel life is kind of your only option, that it's very sad. But like I said, I'm not talking about that, but I don't want to minimize that. Also, targets of police and politicians and judges, people who are involved in the world of dealing with the cartels, either on the illegal side or the legal side. The violence is seldomly tourists, and it's seldomly expats. So I did a video with Greg over at Choosing Mexico a few months back, and he talked about how it's about 20 U.S. citizens dying in Mexico a year. I think that was maybe outside the zones along the border. And a lot of the people who are involved in the drug trade do have dual citizenship. So there are people who are American citizens who are dying in Mexico who are part of that drug trade. So I think it was 20 U.S. citizens die in Mexico that are outside of that. So, for example, we have just this past fall, Shankella, I think is her name. Tomorrow is her 26th birthday. If you're watching this on the day that I release it, or would have been her 26th birthday. But she was killed in San Jose del Cabo. And it turns out she was killed by the people that she came to Mexico with. So that's an example of U.S. citizens dying in Mexico, but not necessarily at the hands of Mexicans. There was another two Canadians that were killed, I think, over in the Yucatan, but they realized that they were tied to organized crime too. So there's a lot of things like that might be people dying in Mexico, but not necessarily people who were either not connected to some criminal element, or also that the perpetrators were from the U.S. Now, also, I want to recognize there was a man named Chuck Crabtree who was, I think, a completely innocent victim of random violence in, I think it was Baja California Sur, Bahia de Los Angeles. That was a few months back, and he was killed by someone. And I think this was maybe a botched robbery or something like that. So some of that stuff does happen. I don't want to say that Mexico is some kind of Valhalla or something like that. It is possible that bad things can happen here, and to people who are completely innocent, complete bystanders, or completely not involved at all, not crossing paths with the cartels. However, I think if we look at, I was reading something here, let me pull it up. So this is an article on the website Mexico News Daily, and I subscribe to them. I think I pay like $2 or $3 a month, and I like this because it's English language news about Mexico. But this is kind of almost like an opinion piece. But let me just read a little bit of this. People, especially from the U.S., seem to have become particularly disillusioned with their own country at this point. Gangs of narco traffickers with specific targets don't seem like much of a big deal compared to the prospect of young men walking to schools, grocery stores, movie theaters to mow down the places with easily accessible combat weapons they acquire under the guise of self-defense. Add in Looney Tunes politics, and it's no wonder people are looking for something different. So I think that is a great point, is that things are getting less safe in the United States, and less safe in a way that is pretty random. So why not come down to Mexico where it's a little less random? Now, this article, and I'll have a link down to it below, does go into some of the negative impacts on society of there being so many people who are wealthier moving to Mexico. And I think it's something that we need to think about. But here we're sticking with talking about violent crime. And as I mentioned, most cartel-related violence is geographically limited. So let me go to some other websites that show maps and statistics and whatnot. So here is a map that shows the number of different kind of cartels or gangs or whatnot that are operating in each state. And of course, with the green being the least number of criminal groups that are operating, which means there's less conflict between them and thus less violence. And here is a list of cities across the world, and you can see the top 5 or so are cities in Mexico that have the highest levels of violence. So up to 134 homicides per 100,000 in the city of Tijuana. So right there, a lot of the areas along the border can be very violent and very unsafe. And for reference, I think across the United States, the number is something like 7 homicides per 100,000. But as it happens in the United States, it is very geographically located in the United States, mostly in big cities, and less so in other areas. So let's go down the list here. We can see the top 5. Then we go into Mexico. But like St. Louis in the United States, 64. So that's almost 10 times the average homicide rate. And that's, I think, what's going on here in Mexico is we look at the average is so skewed by some of these incredibly violent places. And as long as you stay away from those violent places, you are much less likely to experience any violent crime than being just in a general place in the United States where something can happen very randomly. There's just many more guns, much more gun violence. Here in Mexico, once again, the guns are mostly owned by the military or the cartels. And another thing to note is how much this can change over time. So this gets a little bit tricky because let's go to Baja California Sur, which is the state that I live in here in La Paz. And here it is. You can see it. So currently about 7 homicides per 100,000. So about even with what's going on in the average place in the United States. But if you go back a few years, it jumps all the way up to close to 70 homicides per 100,000. And this was after El Chapo was arrested and sent to the United States. There was a lot of fighting for the territory that he left behind, as I understand it. And so there was a lot of violence back then, but now it has really gone down. But once again, that violence was pretty limited to young men who were involved in these cartels. But if you scroll up, you can also see that some areas are significantly there in the kind of the high numbers for a good deal of time. And those are the areas where there is more cartel exposure. As expats who are coming in, if you're able to get a temporary residency visa or a permanent residency visa, you are definitely more well off than the average Mexican because you have to prove you have the financial means to support yourself. So expats typically have the ability, the means to move to safer places. Not saying that they, necessarily, buy a house in an area and then realize, oh my God, this is a violent area, I need to move. But they can move directly to a place that is less violent, or even in a community where there is violence, they can move to a safer part of that community. A lot of Mexicans don't have the means to do that. And I think we need to recognize that it is a luxury that we have to be able to avoid the violent parts of Mexico. So that is why you're not hearing about it that much on YouTube from expats that are talking about their lives here. You are hearing about it on channels where they're just wanting to talk about violence, because the violence does exist, but it does not exist in the typical life of an expat in Mexico. So I would love it if you joined in on the comments down below and let me know your experience or your thoughts on this topic. I'm sure folks have a lot of thoughts on this topic, and I would love to read them, and other folks can read them and kind of hear about what people's experiences have been or what they haven't been. Also, be sure to click that subscribe button if you haven't already, and check out some other videos here that are perfect just for you. Hasta luego.